Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the YLP's knowledge session for the month of March. We are thankful for you guys signing in and registering for our session. Today's session is on the topic From Bid Preparation to Awards, a practitioner's guide to avoiding pitfalls in Nigerian oil licensing. Our facilitator for today is Elo Adhekpukoli, who is a senior associate at Olaniwa Ajayi. Elo, do you want to acknowledge that before I read your brief profile?
Yes, thank you
Could you
very
please?
much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So, Elo Adhekpukoli is a senior associate with Olaniwa Ajayi Legal Practice. He is a legal practitioner and a business recovery and insolvency practitioner with over a decade's experience in cross-border and domestic mergers, acquisition, and private equity investments, contract management, due diligence, investigations, regulatory compliance, legal risk analysis, commercial dispute resolutions, business restructuring, and business recovery. He has advised on mergers, acquisitions, and divestment transactions in the entire oil, gas, and power value chain, and several other sectors, including healthcare, cement manufacturing, telecommunication services, maritime, football, infrastructure, pension, music and entertainment, insurance, and financial services sectors. Elo also has extensive experience in commercial dispute resolution. He also has a brief in-house experience providing high-level legal support to the operational readiness project team to ensure the seamless transition of the operations, assets, and employees of Mobile Producing Nigeria Unlimited to Seplat Nigeria PLC. Elo is a well-cited author globally, particularly notable for his publication on the democratization of electricity in Nigeria, published in the Electricity Journal by LVCA. He was elected to the governing executive committee of the Nigerian Bar Association Lagos branch, where he served a 2-year term as publicity secretary from 2021 to 2023. He is a member of the Nigerian Bar Association, Nigerian Gas Association, Business Recovery and Insolvency Practitioners Association of Nigeria, and Lagos Chamber of Commerce International Arbitration Center. So Elo comes highly packed, highly experienced, highly valuable, and more than capable enough to speak to this topic. Bearing in mind that currently Nigeria is currently undergoing its oil licensing for 2025. So Elo, thank you very much again for coming on, agreeing to give us this session, and we hope to have a very successful session with you.
Thank you very much, Hussein, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making our time to uh, come online to participate in this knowledge sharing session. And I believe sessions like this are not just for knowledge sharing. Uh, I believe it would spur us or inspire us to become more practical in terms of taking steps towards forming business uh, interest to take advantage of the opportunities that abound in this sector. So I'm mindful of the fact that I'm not speaking to lawyers alone, and we've titled this topic. Uh, Sorry, Hussein, I can't see your screen very well.
Wow, should be able to say it.
Okay, I
Can you
can
see
see
it
it very
now?
well now.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay.
So
I
so this
wanted to have,
afternoon,
okay.
yes, this afternoon we'll be talking about how you can structure or advise on preparing bids to be able to stand a better chance to secure a favorable award, and also going ahead to ensure that you maximize the award that is granted by the NUPRC. So essentially, we're talking about upstream oil licensing, and we're looking at guides to avoiding pitfalls, general guides. So today I would look at the topic from different angles. I'll talk about the regulatory and the institutional framework. First, I will give a brief summary of that so that you understand what the framework looks like. Hussein, you can go to the table of content so that everyone can see. So I will start by talking about the regulatory and institutional framework for oil licensing in the upstream sector as it relates to this topic. I will talk about the licensing round structure briefly, and then we'll go into EOI preparations, that's the expression of interest preparations, and the pre-qualification criteria for that particular phase. And then I will touch on how to craft a competitive bid. Then we'll look into evaluation, award, and contracting briefly. And then we'll look at the key parameters for determining winning bid, essentially based on, this is largely based on interactions with the regulator in that sector, that's the NUPRC. And then we'll look at the key pitfalls to avoid, which is the meat of this presentation. We'll look at the key pitfalls from a regulatory perspective. What are those pitfalls that would trigger the NUPRC to reject a bid or to take adverse action against bidders, for example? And then we'll also look at key pitfalls to avoid when you look at the structural arrangement between the bidders, especially where you don't have a single bidder that is going it all alone. And typically in this industry, you would find different entities coming together to collaborate. So what are the pitfalls in that kind of structure that would help you to avoid adverse decisions and outcomes when you talk about bid success rate? And then we'll then look at some practical steps to how, or considerations as to how you can structure We'll look at practical steps as well you can structure your consortium or JV arrangement, especially institutions where different parties come together to collaborate and submit a bid for an oil block. And then finally, we would close with best practices for practitioners to adopt so that the chances of helping your clients to succeed, and in situations where you are the business, you are the person with the business interest, you're in a better position to succeed with your bid. So I think without much ado, I would like to go straight into our presentation for today. So talking about the regulatory and institutional framework, the first point to note is that this entire process is regulated by the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021, which vests all petroleum resources in the Nigerian state and also mandates a transparent, competitive licensing process, which is typically overseen by the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, which is the NUPRC. And then you also have the licensing round regulations of 2022, which defines the objectives of fairness, transparency, competitiveness, and so on and so forth, aligning the process with the national energy policy, essentially. So that regulation guides, it provides more details on how the NUPRC should conduct bid rounds. And then you then have the NUPRC guidelines. There's the guidelines for the current bidding process going on, which is the 2025 guidelines. And typically for each round, NUPRC would make specific rules based on the type of assets that are on offer, the objectives that it wants to achieve, and also the economic circumstances prevailing at the time. So essentially, you have this legal framework, and then from an institutional perspective, you have the NUPRC that supervises this process, develops the licensing plans, manages the pre-qualification process, administers bid evaluation, and then recommends winners to the minister. And it also oversees issues like access to seismic data and also post-award compliance. Let's move on to the next slide. So what does the licensing round structure look like? So typically it starts from a policy announcement. The NUPRC would announce that on behalf of the government, to announce that the government is about to issue licenses to bidders for new oil blocks. And this is done periodically because the interest, the economic policy and interest of the country is to exploit and maximize the petroleum resources that we have in abundance. And given that uh, oil and gas remains pivotal for national development and even globally, the world practically runs on oil and gas, even though there's been a lot of talk and frenzy about transition to renewable energy, but essentially as of today and going into the nearest future, the near term to medium term, oil and gas will still remain very, very relevant. And I'm sure we can all see the impact of the ongoing war in the Middle East and how it has impacted oil and gas supplies, petroleum product supplies across, the world. Prices have gone up, across the world, and we're feeling it as well in Nigeria. So the world essentially runs on oil and gas. So when things don't go well in that industry, it trickles down to other sectors of the economy. For example, now that prices have gone up, very soon we'll start seeing the figures in inflation. We'll see an inflationary trend in other products that depend on the pricing in the oil and gas sector and so on. And so it just trickles down. So it remains very important, and the government pays particular attention to the oil and gas industry. It is a matter of national security for a country like Nigeria, for example. So government would periodically announce that it is going to award new licenses because it wants to increase production levels so that there's more revenue for the government, so that there's more job creation, and so that the economy thrives as well. So after the announcement, the portal will be launched by the NUPRC, the bid portal. And then after that, you then have companies who are interested going onto the portal to register. So there's the registration phase, and this is where you submit your expression of interest, and then you are pre-qualified. So that this is the first phase of trying to separate or sift out entities that are not very ready to manage the assets that they are bidding for. So there's a pre-qualification process. I'm going to come back to this particular process because you have pitfalls in that process. So because that's the first stage of disqualifying or qualifying potential awardees. And then you have the evaluation stage and the data access stage. So typically, and currently, this is where we are with the 2025 rounds. The pre-qualified entities are now, evaluating the seismic data, which will then guide them and help them to craft their technical and commercial bids, which leads us to the fourth phase, which is the bid submission. So after evaluating the data, the entities would prepare their technical and commercial bids because essentially the NUPRC doesn't want people to fly blindly. Let me put it that way. So you need to know what you are bidding for. You need to know the amount of reserves in a particular oil block that is up for bidding, so that you're able to come up with a financial model. You're able to prepare your cost analysis on how you are able on how you will be able to work that asset and get to production. Because let's not forget that even if you win the bid, there's a timeline within which the NUPRC also expects that you should be able to get to production and begin to derive economic benefits from the asset. So after the bid submission, you would have the commercial conference stage. Before this stage, the NUPRC would have looked at all the bids, evaluated all the bids, and then it would evaluate the bids from a technical perspective. There will be another round of, separating the entities that qualify for that stage, and then you go to the commercial conference where you would have the announcement of preferred bidders for each block, and you have the reserved bidders, and then you then move over to the phase of the award and ministerial approval. So in between the commercial conference, the announcement of winners, and then the award of the licenses, there are also steps that will be taken, and I will come to that. But this is just a summary of the entire process. And during this process, you're allowed to go back to the NUPRC to request for clarification. The NUPRC will typically organize pre-bid conferences uh, and also have public stakeholder engagement and so on and so forth. So let's move on to the next slide. So talking about the submission of your expression of interest, what are the pre-qualification criteria that you need to be mindful of when preparing your bids or when advising your clients to prepare and submit their bid? The first is the legal aspects. Your incorporation documents will be required. The NUPRC wants to know who the entities are, who are those behind the entity. So you would have beneficial ownership disclosures. So the essence is that you do not, the government does not want key assets, national assets, to fall into the wrong hands. So they will typically request for these details. And then you would have to present tax clearance certificates, solvency affidavits to show that the company or the entity is still solvent, because this industry is capital intensive and you must be able to show that you have the financial strength and capability to be able to manage and operate the asset. And then there's also a letter of good standing that will be required from the CAC. I would come back to issues around these legal criteria that you need to consider when trying to avoid pitfalls, especially talking about the shareholders and the JV structure and so on and so forth. So for the financial side of things, the NUPRC will look at the annual turnover of the entity or the entities that are bidding, the cash in the bank or parent company guarantees or bank guarantees. So essentially, you either must have if an annual turnover, average annual turnover of say up to $40 million US dollars. If you are bidding for onshore and shallow water assets, or you would have $100 million for deep water assets. But typically, even if you don't have that turnover, because sometimes different entities come together to set up a new company, and that company has no operational history or financial history. So the parent company would have to show these details essentially to be able to pre-qualify. Or you can get a bank to provide a guarantee that they're going to fund the project. So the bank will give a guarantee up to this amount to cover for that shortfall, just in case your annual turnover or the annual turnover of the bidders do not amount to this financial threshold. And then you have the technical pre-qualification criteria. Essentially, the enterprise wants to see a good track record. They don't want to give those assets to entities that cannot operate the asset, because the entire purpose of the bidding rounds will then be defeated. So they want to see operational experience in petroleum geology and geophysics, exploration, drilling, production, reservoir management, and other comparable projects, essentially. And in a few cases, or let me say in a couple of cases, you find a single entity that meets all these requirements. They meet all the legal requirements. They meet all the financial requirements. They meet all the technical requirements. They also meet all the HSE requirements. And so they have to go alone. They can bid alone. But most times, more often than not, you would find so many companies huddling up together, especially Nigerian entities. So typically, that's what we experience in that sector. You find different entities coming together. So you have a company that has experience providing services, drilling services, and that's their forte, that's their strength. So they can bring that into the consortium. And then you can have an entity that has, the money, for example, say a financial institution or an investment company that has the financial backbone. They bring that into the consortium. And then sometimes, for many reasons, it's better to have an entity that has the kind of legal structure in place that will be appealing to the NUPRC and ultimately the decision maker. And so they can also bring that entity on board and go and, queue behind that entity that is likely to to win the bid. So essentially, you want to put your best foot forward when you are at this expression of interest stage, and you want to, as much as possible, have a good synergy between the parties, so that you can all win together. Because when you come together, you have to win together. If you don't win together, you will lose together, and everybody goes home without uh, success. So finally, on the pre-qualification criteria, you have the health, safety, and environmental performance records. Uh, you can have an entity that comes with this kind of experience. And then you must have a host community development plan as well. And then as part of your environmental qualifications and presentation, you should be able to show decarbonization and emissions management. And this is where issues about how you are going to deal with matters such as gas flaring and so on and so forth will come into play when your bid is being evaluated. And typically, the NUPRC would pre-qualify uh, bidders at this point, and it is after the pre-qualification is done, then access to seismic data and geological data would then be provided to the bidders. Let's move on. So, how do you craft a competitive bid? You have your technical bid, you have your commercial bid, and then there's also bid guarantees that you must provide. So when talking about your technical bid, you would have to present a good work program, and then your exploration strategy, your drilling plans, and your development concept. This is where you need your technical staff or partners to come in, and they have to prepare this program in a way that the NUPRC would be attracted to the bid, to convince the NUPRC essentially. Because if your technical proposal is not strong enough, if it's not convincing enough, it's going to be difficult to win the bid. But this is very technical, but even as lawyers, you can still guide your clients. There are certain things that are expected that you should be able to point out to your clients. You're not expected to go deep into the engineering issues, but there are some basic requirements. So it has to be milestone based and credible. So you should be able to show to the NUPRC that within so period of time, this is what we will do. So you will show the key milestones of every single step that you're going to take from when you are granted access to the asset up to when you are able to achieve production. So you make technical projections based on what you've seen in the seismic data, what your engineers have seen in the seismic data. So you do your analysis carefully and make it milestone based, so that the NUPRC will make projections. And typically, you know that oftentimes you hear the government coming up to say, in 1 or 2 years, we're going to increase production by so number of barrels. The government makes those statements based on the kind of work programs that operators have submitted. So operators have assured the government that this is what we are doing to get us to 100,000 barrels per day or 200,000 barrels per day. So you would find the NUPRC or the Minister of Petroleum or even the President himself, coming out to make policy statements in investment forums and so on and so forth, saying that, okay, in the next 1 or 2 years, Nigeria is going to achieve a certain level of production. It is based essentially on the work program that they are seeing from the operators on ground. So this is why it is very important to ensure that it is milestone based and it is credible enough, so that the government doesn't then make wrong policy statements or wrong policy projections and also make wrong budgetary projections. So this is very key and it is very important. And also, the work program must include geological and geophysical analysis. You must provide a drilling plan. You will typically find these things in the licensing regulations that we mentioned, and in parts of the PIA itself. You must include your HSE plan, your ESG plan, and then your work program must, your financial model should be able to support the implementation of your work program. So your commercial bid would be based on how the work program has been developed. So it is very important to have that in mind. And typically for bidding processes, you would find bidding entities bring a consortium of advisors. So you have the lawyers in the room, you would have the financial advisors in the room who will do the financial modeling and all of that. You would have the technical guys, the engineers in the room as well, who would interpret the data and be able to advise on the steps that can be taken, the amount of money, what would be involved, and so on and so forth. So you'd have all of these professionals in the room. And so moving on so I've mentioned that the work program has to be very solid, and then the commercial bid as well has to be attractive. So government wants more money, essentially, and you want to outbid your competitors, especially if you are very sure of the amount of reserves in the asset that you are bidding for. If you know what you are bidding for, you can then make projections. But as much as possible, you don't also want to overbid for the asset because you will then run into challenges. And I will come into the issue of commitments that you present in your bidding documents because those commitments, the NUPRC would hold on to those commitments and appraise you based on those commitments, even after issuing the award. So the first thing that you need to consider in your commercial bid is the amount of signature bonus that you're offering to the government. So typically, there's a range, and this is a new practice. Previously, you would have a fixed, the enterprise will come up with a fixed amount. Typically, I think previously it was around 10 million US dollars. So whatever happens, you must go and make sure that you find $10 million for your signature bonus. But now you then have a range of say 3 to 7 million US dollars for your signature bonus because definitely all the different assets are not equal in terms of the volume of oil and gas that they have in them. So you may bid for somebody may submit a bid and offer 3 million US dollars for one asset. For another asset, knowing that they would likely derive more gas or more oil, they would bid higher for that. So you want to submit a good signature bonus. So for example, if you are bidding for an asset and you have a competitor, if you propose a signature bonus of 5 million US dollars and your competitor goes to the limit of $7 million, you started losing out automatically. If all things being equal, if other things are equal and all of that, you're likely to lose out on that bid because somebody is offering, is an auction essentially. Somebody is offering more than you. And then the work program financial commitment. I mentioned earlier that when crafting your work program, it has to be properly backed by financial commitment. So in your commercial bid, you then submit a budget for the work program to say, okay, if we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, F to be able to get to production, this is how much each phase will cost. So you do the costing analysis, you do the financial modeling, and then you submit a budget to say, for us to be able to get to production, we are committed to spending $1 billion in the next 3 years or in the next 2 years, depending on the kind of program and the timelines you have submitted. So again, this is also part of the basis for which you would hear policymakers or representatives of the government going to say that they're expecting investors to bring in so and so amount of money into the oil and gas industry. They're making those statements, policy statements, because they're seeing numbers that have been submitted to them. They are seeing commitments, financial commitments that investors are making to say, we want to bring in $3 billion to come into Nigeria and explore for oil. This is talking about those that have won the bid, because after winning the bid and you receive the award, every commitment you have made will then become material that the government uses to make its own projections, because you made a promise that based on this work program I'm submitting, this is how much I'm going to spend. Now they're giving you the award. They expect that you bring in that money. So when government is making projections and policy statements, it is based on this commitment that professionals and bidders have, put together when submitting their bids. So there's no fixed amount for work, financial commitments for a work program. So structure, an entity may structure its own model in a way that it will spend less than a competitor. It doesn't mean that the other competitor will not be able to get to production. It just, like they say, you have different routes to get to the market. Some companies are more efficient. So it depends on the resources they have on ground. It depends on whether they're going to subcontract part of the work program, or maybe they have those resources or capacities internally, in-house. So you would have different budgets, essentially, to get to production. So, but one thing you must note, if somebody is proposing to bring in more money, the the psychology of the government or the regulator, based on previous engagement, is that the person bringing in more money will do better for the economy because they're coming to spend more money in Nigeria. And the more money that comes into the economy, the better for the government, the better for the economy. So typically, the regulator may gravitate towards that particular party when evaluating the bid. But oftentimes, you have no way of knowing what your competitors have submitted because everything is confidential. But again, the most important thing as a practitioner is to ensure that your client is not over promising. And this is mainly for financial practitioners as well as legal anyway. You would make sure that everything you've done is credible, it's scientific enough, and is backed by all the indices and all the facts on ground. So you don't overpromise, or you don't make projections that are below expectations. Because don't forget, the regulator also has technical experts that know what it will take to go into those assets and get them to production. So there's a lot of benchmarking that will go on internally, when evaluation is being done. But just have that in mind that somebody that proposes to bring in more money also has the edge because you're not talking about the commercial side of things. And government is looking for investors to come in. And then you have a work performance security of 1% that must be submitted. And this is the minimum. It doesn't mean that you cannot submit a performance security of more than 1%. So essentially, this is 1% of what you have promised, your financial commitment for your work program. You will provide security of 1% of that amount. So if you know, or if your client knows, assuming you are a practitioner, that you don't have 1% of the financial commitment that you are making or that your client is making, the advisable thing to do is to be realistic. So you may need to go back, and this is where all of the financial modeling comes into play, because you must provide performance security to the NUPRC. And if your client is very buoyant, has enough financial backing, or if you as the person with the business interest has enough financial backing, you can decide that, well, I want to go beyond the barest minimum of 1%. I want to give the NUPRC a performance security of 5% so that they know that I'm serious. It's competition. You're competing against others. So as much as possible, you want to bring your A game to the table. You want to put your best foot forward. So if your strength against your competitors is your financial muscle, then you have to play to that. You can even decide that, look, I can even give the enterprise 15% performance security. It all depends on the facts on ground and the circumstances. And if you are very sure, or if the client is very sure of the quality of that asset, they know that when they go into that asset, they can see a pathway to profitability within a specific period of time. Then you can then make commercial bid that even if things go wrong, your client is not in any form of trouble or challenge. And then again, finally, uh, the decision to award a bid to a particular bidder will be based on weighted points and scores between the technical bid and the commercial bid. We're not going into all of that for the purpose of this presentation, but your scores for the technical bid will be combined with your scores for the commercial bid to then determine the overall score of everyone. So these are different, and I'm going to come back to the criteria for awarding winning bids. I'll come back to that. So going into the third part, you have the bid guarantee. So you must also be able to provide a 5% guarantee for your signature bonus, and it must be valid for a minimum of 120 days from the commercial bid conference. And the NUPRC may extend this period as well. So you must be ready to go back to your financial institution that is backing you, that is providing that guarantee, assuming you don't have the money sitting in your balance sheet or in your bank. You must be able to have a flexible arrangement with your financial institutions, letting them know that there could be possibilities for extension, so that when it's time to extend, your financial institution does not pull the plug and then you lose out. So I will come to that as well, because that's something that that's one pitfall that we'll come back to. And then the financial institution must be a qualified uh, institution, minimum of BB rating. It must be rated properly. And if your bid guarantee is invalid, if you get a bid guarantee from a financial institution that does not meet the minimum rating requirement, it amounts to instant disqualification. Or if your bid submission does not have that guarantee, it also results in instant disqualification. So let's move on to the next slide. So here we're going to talk about evaluation. I know I already started discussing issues around evaluation and award and so on. But essentially, this is just to walk you through the process, but not with much technical details. So, like I mentioned before, uh, you're going to have technical evaluation before the commercial conference. So, only bidders that pass through through the technical evaluation would advance to the commercial evaluation. And then after the commercial evaluation, during the commercial conference, the bids are opened publicly. They are opened publicly. And why is this so? So that the incidence of malpractice will be reduced. So for transparency, everything will be opened at once. So no person has an advantage. Uh, you want to protect the regulator and also protect the integrity of the process. So there's no opportunity for any member of staff of the regulator to open a commercial bid and see what one party has bidded. And then, there's information leak to competitors and they quickly uh, adjust their bids and so on. Because depending on the rules that are set out by the NUPRC, there is a stage at which parties may be able to go back, bidders may be able to go back and make adjustments. And there's also a phase at which that opportunity would not be there. So it varies. So the bids are opened publicly, and then the company with the bidder with the highest aggregate score wins the bid, essentially. And then offer letters will be issued within 14 working days to the preferred bidders. You would also have the reserved bidders, waiting on the sideline. And then after the offer letter is issued, you then have a 90-day compliance to pay the signature bonus and submit every other document and information relating to the guarantees that the NUPRC may require at that point if they have not been submitted previously. And then you would also execute a model contract with the NUPRC. And then you move to the stage of the grant of the petroleum prospecting license by the minister on the recommendation of the NUPRC. So that's the bird's eye view of the evaluation, the award, and the contracting stage. So it is after you have received that ministerial grant of the PPL, that is when you can, heave a sigh of relief. That is when you can heave a sigh of relief. Between when the offer letter is issued and when you get to that stage, a lot of things usually happen, and I'm going to come to that. This is where you would find, you know, parties or partners, consortium members, uh, falling through the cracks. Some are not able to meet up with certain requirements. Some are not able to make payments of signature bonus. Then you begin to have different cases in court. The NUPRC takes action, and then the bidders challenge the action of the NUPRC because they've committed so much, and it's so difficult, having come so far, in the journey, to then lose out. The loss will be huge. So people would fight and do everything that they can at this phase to ensure that they don't lose out entirely. So a lot of things usually happen between the offer letter and the grant of the PPL. And I will come back to the pitfalls that you must avoid when advising your clients or when preparing your bid, because that is where you have the real risk. So let's move on to the next slide. So coming back to the parameters for determining winning bids. I said I was going to come back to this. And I already mentioned the signature bonus that is offered. I already said preference will be given to higher offers. I already talked about the work program commitment, the budgetary commitments that has been made, and how credible the commitments are. And then I also talked about the performance security of a minimum of 1%. And but I mentioned that preference may be given to bids with higher security as well. And then I also talked about weighted score on both the commercial and the technical bid. So these are some of the parameters that the NUPRC would typically consider when determining the bid that clinches the asset. Let's move on quickly to the next slide. So what are the key pitfalls to avoid? So I mentioned during the introductory segment of this presentation that I will look at the pitfalls from both the regulatory perspective, that is talking about the kind of things that would, trigger the NUPRC to discountenance a bid. And then I will also talk about the structural perspective, which has to do with the commercial and the structural arrangements between the consortium members or the partners, as the case may be. So the first thing is incomplete submission or late submission. So if your submission is not complete, if you don't submit all the documents that are required, your bid will be disqualified without exception. So you must ensure that every single document that is required by the NUPRC is submitted, number one. And number two, because it is a competition, you cannot afford to submit late. Even if you are 1 second late, you will not be allowed to submit your bid. And I know a lot of people think that, oh, this is Nigeria, government, and so on and so forth. There's a Nigerian way of doing things. I have seen instances where even entities controlled by Africa's richest man have been turned back because they came late. They arrived late. Because I've been privileged to be part, not specifically for oil bidding rounds, but I've had to advise. I've been privileged to advise a regulatory agency that was conducting a competitive bid for the divestment of certain assets. So I know this firsthand. So you have rejections that happen, no matter the money that you have and so on, because there's that desire to create a level playing field. And it is important for us to know, both as industry practitioners and as businessmen with the key business interests to know that the stakes are high. And sometimes, even if you have the political leverage or the relationships, or even if you have the money and so on and so forth, if you fail on basic compliance requirements, you are likely to lose out. And why is this so? If a competitor gets to find out that somebody that won a bid submitted late or submitted incomplete documents, you are likely to have litigation. And the government does not want that. The cost of the litigation, the several injunctive reliefs that will be granted, preventing government from doing anything relating to the asset, or even in terms of the bid rounds itself, asking government to stay proceedings, to stay action on the bid rounds. Government wants to avoid those kind of risks. So there is usually no grace for incomplete documentation, no grace for late submission. It is outright disqualification without exception. And then you have issues of misrepresentation, submitting false or inconsistent financial, technical, or ownership statements. So the NUPRC does not request for those documents and information for nothing. They would run background checks. So you must make sure that whatsoever you are presenting to the regulator is backed by evidence. So your role as a practitioner is to ensure that your client has crossed the T's and dotted all the I's, and that there's evidence to back every single material statement that is being put forward to the regulator. Otherwise, you run the risk, or your client runs the risk of being disqualified. And then you have the issues of consortium violations with requirements. So even though the arrangement, the consortium arrangement is a private arrangement between the parties, the NUPRC expects that whoever will be named as the operator in that consortium must have minimum 30% interest, because operatorship is key. This is not a paper business. If the government gives you an asset, you must be ready to go into the asset. So don't come back with. So the NUPRC wants to be sure that whoever is going to be the operator has enough skin in the game. So you must be ready. You must be ready. And also, you must not have multiple bids from affiliates. So you have to be very sure. So when you are putting your consortium together, you must ask this question. Are you part of another bid? Are you part of another consortium that is bidding for the same asset? Because if you have multiple bids from affiliates or the same parties, going through different routes, so you join consortium A, maybe as financial partner, you go and join consortium B to provide another, maybe to be the technical and operational partner. You're beginning to run foul of the expectations of the NUPRC. And because of that, the bid may be disqualified. The bid may be disqualified. Because as much as possible, the NUPRC wants to give a level playing field to different entities so that there's no concentration of the assets in a few hands as much as possible. Because really, there are some business entities that can afford to, take as much assets as they can because of their financial and technical and operational capabilities, which is huge. But the NUPRC, for energy security purposes, based on national policy, as much as possible, wants the assets to get into as many hands so that there's more opportunity and there's less competition. There's less concentration of assets, which then leads to monopoly. Let me put it that way. So the government is also mindful of monopoly, both directly and indirectly. So that is why they pay attention to the structures around each consortium and the role that each party or each partner in the consortium will play. And then you have issues of insufficient capacity. Typically, you have newly incorporated entities that have no records, shell companies, shelf companies. Maybe because due to the nature of the structure that the parties have adopted, they may decide to set up a special purpose vehicle. Now, that special purpose vehicle has no track record in terms of technical capabilities, previous projects implemented, no financial records, but it's still acceptable, but subject to providing parent company documentation to back up that entity. So typically, all the partners will come together and bring all their documentation and experience, and that would count for the new entity that they are setting up. So the NUPRC will look beyond the empty shell company that has just been registered to the documentation that has been submitted by all the partners backing that entity. So all those requirements that we have discussed before, when you are putting a consortium together, each party must have those documents in place, their tax clearance certificates, affidavit of solvency, and so on and so forth. So everybody must have those documents. Otherwise, the bid can fail. You also have instances where entities submit bids and their track record does not show that they have enough capacity to be able to operate the asset and make it profitable. The bid is likely to fail. You also have insufficient financial capacity. If the NUPRC looks at the balance sheet, the books, the financial records of the entities that are bidding, and says that these are companies that are struggling financially, and if the NUPRC does not receive enough comfort from a parent company guarantee or a bank guarantee, the bid will be deemed as insufficient, to have insufficient capacity, and you would have challenges at that point. So that is a pitfall. You have the pitfall of insufficient capacity to resolve. And then you have issues related to poor data interpretation. Now, when you interpret the data poorly, your work program from your technical guys is likely to be faulty. If the work program is faulty, the financial modeling and the commercial bids will be faulty, because you'll be making financial projections based on a work program that is defective. You would most likely end up submitting a bid, or your clients may end up submitting a bid based on poor data interpretation, and you can run into problems by the time you get the award and you want to operate the asset. So this particular pitfall, you would feel the effects in the future if you win that bid and you want to operate. Because by the time you now get to the field, reality will now stare you in the face, or reality will now stare your client in the face. And meanwhile, your client probably has entered into financial arrangements and committed to obligations to a financial institution to say, look, give me this amount of loan, which I would need to operate this asset. And then you get to the asset and you realize that you need more money, or the amount of oil, crude oil and gas reserves that you think or that you thought that asset had is actually not what you thought it was. So even if you implement your work program from day one or day zero, you are going to run into huge losses. And I've seen instances like this in the industry. And this is also one of the reasons why you will typically see in the news that government awarded licenses to, let me use an hypothetical number, 50 awardees. 10 years down the line, only 4 or 5 have been able to get to production. This is where that problem starts from. They've made wrong projections. So when they get the award, reality stares them in the face. They realize that it's either they don't have enough money, or they realize that the reserves, the resources in that particular asset is just not economical. It's of no use. It's of no use. Because, for example, let me break it down. If it's a shallow water field, you still need some kind of drilling rigs or ship. It doesn't matter the amount of crude oil reserves you have in that field, that shallow water field, if it's just 1 barrel of crude you have there, it doesn't change the cost you would incur to acquire a rig or to rent a rig. So that's where the problem comes from. So this is where the interpretation of data is very important. And so at this current stage of because this is where the NUPRC, the current bidding process is at. The pre-qualified bidders, I think there are about 50 of them based on the news that was released, the news in the last couple of days. I think there are about 50 of them. They are now acquiring seismic data from the NUPRC and interpreting the data so that when they are making their financial projections, they don't make mistakes that will cause problems in future. Because don't forget that by the time you get into the asset, by the time the NUPRC gives you access to the asset, you've already paid your signature bonus. You've already gotten bank guarantees at whatever cost, depending on what you've negotiated, or 5% of your signature bonus. You've spent money to acquire the data. You've spent money to put your bid together. You've probably even engaged personnel and human resources. You've probably gone to acquire plants and machinery that you will need and equipment. So you've incurred a lot of cost. So you don't want to get to the point of, the moment of truth, and you discover that what you have interpreted in the data is not what is in the ground. So this is a major pitfall that your client, or if you are the business man in the room, what your client should, or you should pay attention to. And then you have non-compliance with local content and other regulatory requirements. Now, if you look at the Local Content Act, the Act says that Nigerian companies will be given preference for all bids in the Nigerian petroleum industry. It doesn't preclude foreign interests or foreign companies from bidding. But if there is a Nigerian entity that can show capacity, that they can manage and operate that asset, that they have the financial capability, they have the technical capability, they are likely to win the bid above a foreign entity that has even more capacity. Because for developmental purposes, for national security purposes, government wants to, it's like an affirmative action by government in that sector to bring in enough local players. Because foreign investors, they are foreign, they are visitors. They can wake up tomorrow and say, we're not doing business in Nigeria again. And they are gone the next minute. They pull out all their funds. It affects FX rate and all of that. But if you have the local guys, the indigenous players, this is their country. It's difficult for an indigenous player that has a thriving business to just say, okay, I'm shutting down. I want to go and do my business in another country. And moreover, Nigeria is one of the largest oil and gas producers in Africa. So local players have that home advantage. You also have Nigerian companies going to places like Angola and so on to bid for oil blocks, and they're winning oil blocks in those places, in Tanzania, in Angola, and so on and so forth. But Nigeria is their forte. And so government is trying to build local capacity as much as possible, both in terms of ownership of the assets and in terms of human resources, human capability to operate the asset. So those are the two prongs of local content to consider. But the first thing is ownership. And so when you talk about ownership, essentially simple majority ownership will tick the box. So when you're advising a foreign client that is interested, it's better to advise the client to set up a local entity. In any case, while a foreign entity can submit expression of interest without necessarily registering a local entity, if that foreign entity is pre-qualified to submit a bid, it must then go and incorporate a local entity before it can submit that bid. Because when the license is going to be issued, it will be issued in the name of the local entity. So it just makes more sense so that your client does not fall out of the room, out of the picture at the EOI stage. Just advise your foreign clients to set up a local entity and submit the EOI documents in the name of that local entity. So you know that from day one, you've already scaled that order of local content in terms of, ownership. So typically, when doing that, the clients will need to look for local partners as well. It doesn't mean that the clients cannot only own that local entity. It can only own the local entity, but then it will be at a disadvantage if a Nigerian entity shows enough capacity. But if a Nigerian entity does not show enough capacity for that particular asset amongst the bidders, then even if a foreign entity or a wholly owned Nigerian subsidiary of a foreign entity is bidding for that asset, the NUPRC can award the license. And that's one of the exceptions in the local content rules. Because government also realizes that the oil and gas industry is capital intensive and it is also highly technical. And in some cases, we don't have that technical capacity in country. So in some instances, government can waive the local content requirement and issue licenses. And you typically find things like this when you're bidding for deep water assets, when you're going into the ocean, deep offshore bid, because it takes a lot of financial and technical capacity to go down to an ocean depth of about 11,000, kilometers, for example. Then you then start drilling from that point in the ocean. And most times, the entities that do this, they use robots. Human beings don't even go that deep. And how many Nigerian companies have those robots, for example? So typically you would have governments waive some of those local content requirements for deep offshore bids where there's no Nigerian entity that can show similar capacity. So let's move on to the next slide, please. And then you have the issue of entities that are not fit and proper. Yes, this speaks to technical capacity, but you also have the issues of terrorism financing, money laundering, and bribery. So the entities that are bidding must ensure that they don't fall into any of these classifications. So the government is particular about terrorism financing because if a terrorist organization floats a company and then bids for an oil block and wins the bid, it means that the government you are just helping the terrorist organization to thrive because from that asset they're going to be making a whole lot of money, and from the money they are making from that asset they'll be funding terrorism. So there's a lot of considerations around terrorism financing, money laundering, and bribery when evaluating bids. So when you're advising a client, or even as a businessman, when you're thinking about potential partners, you must make sure that you scrutinize the consortium members or partners to ensure that none of them can be traced to issues around terrorism financing or money laundering and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you'll lose the bid. And then the entities, none of the entities must represent interests that are inimical to the national interest of Nigeria. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the reasons the NUPRC would request that you submit a whole lot of documents surrounding your legal structure. You make disclosures as to beneficial ownership and so on and so forth, because they will run background checks on each entity to check if the entities are entities from a country that is in a sanctions list, of the UN, and if they are linked to terrorism, for example, or if it's a company that's they support interests that work against the interest of Nigeria. You don't want to put your prized national asset in the hands of those entities because it just means that you've scored an own goal. The government has scored an own goal against Nigeria. The government is working against itself. So as a businessman, you need to think about these considerations. As a practitioner, you have to think about these considerations when doing due diligence on potential partners for your client. And then you have issues of unpaid taxes. This is why your tax clearance certificate must be submitted, or the tax clearance certificate of your client must be submitted. So government wants to see that you are up to date with all your taxes, your corporate taxes, withholding tax, VAT, all other forms of petroleum taxes, and employee tax remittances, for example. They want to see that you remit payee and so on and so forth. And then there's also the issue of insolvency, because financial capacity is very key in the bid evaluation process. Any threatened or actual insolvency, either before or during the bid evaluation, is a big problem. And even post-award, before the grant of the license, if the NUPRC gets information that one of the entities in the consortium or the bidding entity itself has insolvency challenges, the license may not be granted, because the NUPRC still has to make that final recommendation to the minister to grant the license. So this is another issue that you must watch closely as a practitioner or as a business entity. And also, when preparing your consortium arrangement, this should also form some of part of the basis for some of the clauses that you would prepare and insist upon in the agreement that brings the consortium together, so that each entity would give representations and warranties that they are solvent and that they will remain solvent for the entire process, and that there's no threatened risk of insolvency. They're not involved in anything that is likely to bring up insolvency, in their operations. And then you have another pitfall, which I've identified as indebtedness to the federal government of Nigeria. You must have a clean financial record with the government. So, for example, if you have been doing business with government, you have been getting government contracts and so on and so forth, and if you've been doing things with government essentially, or maybe from your operations, there are some monies that you ought to have paid to the NUPRC, and you are owing. You are not likely to get the award, except the government decides to waive that consideration, not waive the indebtedness. Government can decide to overlook the indebtedness and say, well, even if this entity is currently owing, but the entity has been good, they've had good track records in the past, they fulfilled their obligations in the past, and we also believe that this current indebtedness, they would be able to pay, and we trust them, and so on and so forth. So discretion can come in when doing the evaluation, provided there is no competing bidder that has something better, that has a better offer on the table. And then you have the issue of poor performance on previous awards. So if the NUPRC, and typically you have most of the bidders, they are industry operators. Some of them already have oil blocks or licensing. And because maybe business is good, they want to acquire more. And there's nothing wrong in that. But if government has given you a previous license, has awarded an oil block to you before, and you cannot show that you have been diligent in operating that asset, it is likely to affect any new bid for new asset that you submit. Because on what basis would the government then trust such a company or such a bidder that if the asset is awarded to that bidder, that they would be able to perform if the previous one that was granted didn't turn out so well? So this is another pitfall to consider. So as a bidding entity or as a consortium, you want to pay attention. You want to ask during your due diligence on your counterparty to say, have you been awarded a previous license, or have you been part of a consortium that was awarded a license previously that has failed to operate the asset, or that has failed to show progress in exploring that asset? So this is another pitfall to consider, because these are some of the things that the regulator will go and check. They will check the record, the operational records of the entities involved. And then you have the issue of neglecting post-award obligation, delaying bonus payment, being slow to commencing your work program, entering into the asset to operate the asset. And these things can lead to cancellation, because the NUPRC prefers to give the asset to somebody that can manage the asset, operate it, and derive benefit and derive economic benefit for itself and for the country. So let's move on. So from a structural commercial perspective, what are some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid as practitioners or as businessmen, as the case may be? So you have the issue of role allocation, because it is the allocation that will determine the expectations of each party, what each party brings to the table. And this will help you deal with issues of incompetent consortium or JV partner. So you must define who your lead consortium partner member is, who would be the technical partner, who will be the financial partner, who plays the operational role. You must address these issues when coming together. These issues would not come up if it's just a single bidder that meets all the requirements. But because in the industry, you usually have people coming together, even the IOCs come together. You hear things like Shell JV and so on and so forth, Total JV. So you have an NPC holding a certain percentage interest or stake, sometimes 55%, 60%, or it could even be less, maybe 30%, depending on what the parties have negotiated for that particular asset. Then you would have Shell holding, say, maybe 30% or 35%, as the case may be, or 40%. Then you have Chevron holding maybe 10% or 20%. You have Total holding 5, 10, 15%, as the case may be. You have NOC or AGIP or any other entity. You have different entities. They come together. That is the nature of the industry. So you have this collaboration across all levels. So you must avoid incompetent partners, because it will lead to poor assessment scores for your bid, and it can also ultimately lead to a failed bid. And then secondly, as a practitioner, you must avoid the issue of poor due diligence. You must conduct proper due diligence on consortium and JV partners, depending on who you are advising, especially where you are asking for the lead member of that consortium. Because most times the lead member may suffer more losses, depending on how the consortium is structured. It may have more skin in the game. So you must ensure that you do proper due diligence on each JV partners to ensure that they are qualified, they are suitable, they are fit and proper, they have all the documentation, they meet all the requirements, they have the requisite experience to be able to help in the role that they are coming into play. So you want to look for evidence of capacity and ability to fulfill the requirements of the bid before reaching a decision to collaborate. So you must be careful how you select your partners. And then there's also the issue of risk and liability sharing. To what extent will the partners be jointly liable, and in what instances will they be severally liable? As in, each party would carry their cross. And if anything goes wrong, that party will be solely responsible for the loss. You have to agree. You have to reach an agreement, because this is where things begin to go awry post-award, when some parties are not able to meet up and the interest of the entire consortium will now be at risk. You should be able to have remedies. You should have a watertight agreement that you can fall back on to deal with such a partner that is not able to meet up. And then you need to address governance and decision making. Who leads the consortium? How would the board, management team, and committees of the consortium be constituted? Who nominates who? Who controls what? You must address these issues. Otherwise, the consortium members will begin to fight against themselves down the line, especially when it turns out that the asset is very lucrative or that there's a lot to be done. And conversely, where it turns out that the asset is going to be more risky and one party wants to pull back, for example. So you must address these issues. And then what are the voting thresholds? How will decisions be made? Because if you don't address these issues, when it's time to make decisions, and I've seen a case like this, where a party won a bid award, and then the consortium member started quarreling over decisions on work program, for example. So one of the parties said, look, we've won this award. This field is lucrative. Let's start doing stuff. Let's, go into let's go and do more research on the asset. Let's go and look at the field. Let's begin to make projections. Another party said, no, let's wait. There's no need to spend this money yet. And that led to a dispute. And the issue of why, one of the parties then began to challenge the decision making of the lead partner to say, you can't even make this decision to take this step. So you have these issues. So on major issues, operational issues, commercial issues, who makes the decision? What is the voting threshold? Must there be a unanimous agreement? Or can an entity that has a certain level of interest be able to carry a decision on a particular issue? Or do you want to leave all technical related issues to the technical partner? So whatever the technical partner decides, all of us will follow through, even if we're going to all incur financial obligations. Is that the structure you want? It depends on who you're advising, it depends on the role you're playing, and it depends on ultimately what the parties want. But decision making is very, very important, because these are the issues that lead to disputes. And I've been privileged to handle disputes arising from issues like this. So they are real. And then you have the issues of confidentiality and non-circumvention. I've also been privileged to deal with issues like this, where one party goes, outside of the consortium and begins to engage directly with the NUPRC. And the presentation of information is not properly done. And at the end of the day, it can trigger adverse action from the NUPRC. So there must be a proper channel of communication so that information is not presented wrongly or in a wrong format, or engagements that should not be had take place. You want to avoid such things. Also, you want to protect intellectual property, because you're going to share information as a consortium. Part of that information would include technical details that are proprietary in nature as to this is how we do our business, this is our business secret, this is what we can do to have an edge in operating this asset, and someone else is getting that information. So you want to have proper confidentiality, non-circumvention agreements, and other restrictive clauses so that that party or one of your consortium partners does not duplicate or take your proprietary or intellectual property or technical information and data to go set up their own company and begin to replicate those things. Because then they then become your competitors instead of your partners. So you must have these types of clauses when structuring your consortium arrangement so that you can protect, depending on who you're advising on, depending on your role as the person with the business interest, you can protect yourself or protect your client, not just in terms of the current arrangement, but for future purposes, for future arrangement. And then you have pitfalls surrounding the dispute resolution mechanism. One of your major considerations is that you want to keep everything within the family. Family disputes resolved in a family way. So you want it to be confidential. You want it to be speedy. Nothing spills out. It's like a marriage. A consortium is like a marriage. You don't want to go wash your dirty linens in public. So instead of going to the open court where you would then see a shouting headline, so and so entity that wants so and so bid in court over so and so issues and so on. And then the regulator is seeing it. Your financial institutions are backing you, they are seeing it. Your investors are seeing it. And they're all wondering, I hope we have not made a mistake putting money in this project and so on and so forth. When it's something is a small dispute or is a dispute that can be managed internally and everybody doesn't have to lose out completely. So you want to think about how speedy and how confidential the dispute resolution mechanism that you adopt in that arrangement would be. So typically it would be ADR, it tilts towards ADRO, and then you would include specific timelines for certain action so that somebody else doesn't play games by, delaying steps through different tactics and so on. So for example, in your typical clause, you can say if there's a dispute, within 5 days, the top level management or the two CEOs will come together and discuss. If they cannot reach an agreement, then you go to arbitration. Notice of arbitration must be presented within so number of days. So you put time limits or timelines to each action so that you can manage that dispute resolution process, properly. So there must be a time within which both parties, for example, must agree so the arbitrators to be appointed. And where they don't agree with that timeline, there must be a provision to say this is how a neutral party would make the appointment. And also, you must impose the timeline. I would advise you impose a timeline on the neutral party that will make that appointment. Otherwise, the neutral party can say, okay, there's no specific time within which I should appoint an arbitrator. So I can wait for 3 months, wait for 1 year, and so on. So you can say, no, within 15 days, the president of so and so arbitration association, wherever the association is, would have the responsibility, will be given the responsibility to make this appointment within within a specific number of days. So that is how you should approach the dispute resolution mechanism. So because you want to avoid triggering the NUPRC, because if the NUPRC gets wind of any troubles within the consortium, it begins to affect how the NUPRC perceives that consortium. They begin to have doubts as to whether that consortium will be able to make progress. And the NUPRC can take action. In a particular instance, I've seen where, because a dispute arose and it led to delay in implementing the work program, going to the field, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, the parties lost out because the NUPRC revoked the license. In some cases, they will re-award the license to another entity. So the dispute then becomes convoluted. So on the one hand, you are still fighting amongst yourself as consortium members. On the other hand, you are fighting as a consortium together to say, no, NUPRC cannot take this action against us at this time. And then you want to avoid reputational challenges as well, especially where you have gone to a financial institution for help. Because there's no banker, there's no financial institution that will sit back. They've given you money, they've given you guarantees. You've submitted their documents to the regulators, which can be acted upon. And then they see you fighting amongst yourself. It's a risk issue for them. And they can pull the plug on whatever arrangements they have with you or with your clients. So these are some of the considerations and pitfalls that must be properly managed when, especially as regards dispute resolution mechanism in your consortium or JV arrangement. Let's move on. And then again, just before we move on, the NUPRC has an alternative dispute resolution center that also handles disputes arising from the industries relating to licenses and other administrative matters relating to awards and so on and so forth. It's an attempt at out-of-court settlement processes or adjudicatory processes. And again, I've seen a situation where a consortium member or an interested party has used this arrangement by the NUPRC to drag the NUPRC into a dispute that led to, delays in the process and all sorts of unintended consequences. Because the NUPRC was then trying to assert itself and exercise jurisdiction. So there was now some sort of conflict between a matter that was already in court that was sub judice and NUPRC also taking decisions on the same issues that have been presented in a court of law. And don't forget that you cannot oust the jurisdiction of the court, the law court. So the parties can always decide to go to court. At the end of the day, whether the court has jurisdiction or not will be determined by the court itself. And that issue of jurisdiction can go all the way to the Supreme Court. And while you are on that long journey to the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court, time is going, government is losing out because there's delay in implementation of the work program. The parties are also losing out. Everybody is at a loss. So this is very, very critical and is a serious pitfall to address early on. So let's move on to the next slide. So how do you structure a consortium or a JV arrangement? I will just give some basic issues to address so that the arrangement is in a good form that will help the party to succeed. You want a good vehicle that will take you to your destination. So the first thing is the ownership structure. Local content requirement. A majority of the shareholders Nigerians, because it helps to just tick that box without stress so that you're not at a disadvantage during evaluation. And then I mentioned before that a foreign company must incorporate or team up with local partners when submitting a bid. So you must address the issue of ownership. Who owns what? Because it helps in regulating the relationship between the consortium members and the JV partner, as well as meeting with regulatory local content requirements of ownership. And then number two, you have to address issues around roles, obligations, benefits, and performance guarantees for those roles. I've talked a lot about roles allocation, but in your arrangement, in whatever agreement you want to sign, whether it's called a MOU, MOA, JVA, consortium agreement, or whatever nomenclature you want to christen your agreement or your document. Pay attention to performance guarantees. Each party, so that you're able to hold on to each party to say, this is what you promised to bring to the table. So there has to be a guarantee that you can hold on to in case they fail to do what they were supposed to do and things go south. So you can get remedy against such a partner. And then you must allocate risks and liabilities around the roles as well. If a party fails to carry out its role properly and it leads to a failed bid or even post-award, it affects operational issues, or maybe it then leads to revocation of the license. Who bears the cost? Who is liable for the losses and the damages? And because the entire process itself is very, very expensive, what would each party contribute financially? And based on the contribution, what should each party get in return from the arrangement? What is the profit sharing arrangement of the parties? If a party cannot meet up with its financial contribution and another party steps in so that the entire project does not fall and fail, what is the remedy? These issues have to be dealt with. Now, you have to deal with issues such as exit or withdrawal and default, scenarios. Because you could have instances where you decide that you all want to go together on the journey. Along the journey, one of the partners says that they want to leave. They're no longer part of the project. They're no longer interested. How do you resolve issues like that? Your JV arrangement must provide for such scenarios. Because don't forget, you are going to win together or lose together. So if a technical partner is pulling out, it means that your bid is going to be defective. Or even if they pull out post-award, it then means that the basis on which you won the bid has been altered. And typically, in certain situations like that, the NUPRC can allow for replacements or substitutions subject to consent, because the NUPRC needs to be sure. They will still go through the entire process. They will still scrutinize the substitute that is coming on board to ensure that that substitute would meet up with the requirements, would be a fit and proper substitute, and so on and so forth. So how do you deal with such issues? So typically, you may want to consider including exit restrictions to say, look, once you are in this till we finish this process. You can't pull out before the award is made or before bid evaluation. After submission of documents, you cannot pull out. And if you pull out, these are the consequences. These are the remedies for other partners that may likely lose out because you are pulling out. So you have lock-in periods. And then preemption rights. If one party is pulling out and another party wants to take over their interest, will there be need for preemption rights so that other partners can step in before it goes outside of the consortium? And typically, you can have these arrangements where another member of the consortium can step into the role that is becoming vacant and can meet the requirements of that role. And then you have issues of forfeiture of rights and obligations for the party that is pulling out at a certain stage, and so on and so forth. So and these are commercial issues. There is no hard and fast rule to these issues. There are no fixed rules. So all the parties, there are commercial issues that will be agreed by consensus. You have to agree, you have to sign and say, this is what we want to do together. This is how we want to regulate ourselves. And then you have misrepresentations, your representation and warranty clauses rather. So typically, misrepresentation should trigger indemnity claims and compensation, essentially, as much as possible. Because don't forget that we mentioned that in the case of misrepresentation, the commission can discountenance the bid. So if a partner misrepresents facts or statements and the consortium loses out on account of the misrepresentation, you must have indemnity provisions. You should be able to make claims and compensation. In situations where you can terminate, maybe post award, and you can easily terminate and replace that entity, how do you take care of such scenario? And then if it leads to bid failures or inability to proceed after award, how do you handle such issues? So your representations and warranties clauses would deal with such issues. Let's move on. I already mentioned indemnity, and typically indemnity should cover bid costs, expenses, professional fees. If there are any regulatory penalties incurred on account of the issues that came up, maybe the breach of the agreement or withdrawal of a partner, or so on and so forth, or misrepresentation, there will be indemnities. You can ask for indemnities. You can negotiate to have indemnity provisions to cover such regulatory penalty. And then you could also agree on damages for the loss of the opportunity. To say, okay, all of us came together, we expended so much resources to get this award. We got the award, and then one party has, done something that has led to a revocation of the award and the license. But all the parties can agree to a negotiated or liquidated damage. Otherwise, if you don't do this in the agreement, the court would apply its discretion and grant whatever it deems fit. But it's much easier. Excuse me.
Please kindly indulge us while Elo tries to reconnect back. I think his audio is having a bit of an issue. Thank you.
Okay, please, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. But your video is off. Thank you. You're back.
Okay. Please confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm almost done. Sorry, my earpiece. I think the battery
You ran
had
out
to
on that
change.
year.
I think I've spoken for almost
An hour
22
plus.
hours. Yes, an hour plus.
Yes.
I'll soon be done. So I've talked about the indemnity clause. I've talked about, I think I mentioned non-circumvention and non-interference previously. You need to continue to have this in your arrangement as well. And then I've also discussed the issues around the dispute resolution mechanism. So there's no need to repeat all of that. So let's move on to the next slide. So what are the best practices for practitioners? I would advise always to start early, or even as a businessman, you know that the government would periodically, conduct licensing rounds periodically. So start early. If you cannot meet up with the current round, start thinking ahead, start preparing ahead, start doing those things that would ensure that you have a good track record, start putting your documentation in place, pay your taxes early, start doing things, start courting potential partners, start making friends. so that you don't end up with strange bedfellows. Look out for those entities that you are likely to partner with in future. Because after the current round, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll have another round again. So this would help you to avoid, issues, compliance issues, documentation issues, and so on and so forth. And then validate data independently. We spoke extensively about this issue. Make sure that you get proper professionals to validate seismic data during pre-bidding, during the bidding process. There are ways you can also acquire data from the NUPRC if you're interested. You don't have to wait for a bidding round. So ahead of time, you know that there is a particular oil block that has not been awarded. You know that in future, the government is likely to award that block. You can start taking steps if you have enough resources to acquire seismic data about that block. You begin to make your projection, and that will then determine whether you're going to throw your hat in the ring when the time comes. And then I spoke about structuring your consortium carefully. No need to repeat myself on that again. And then you need to model commitments conservatively so that whatever you present, whatever financial commitments you make or your clients make is feasible and credible so that you don't overpromise. I worked on a transaction, a power-related transaction, a divestment some years ago. And in that divestment, as the advisors to the government entity divesting that power asset, we had to advise the government to review the performance agreement that it signed sometime around 2012, 2013 with the people, with the various bidders that bought electricity assets across the country. Because between then and as of the time that we're doing that transaction, it was then obvious to everybody in the industry that the bids, people submitted bids on wrong assumptions of what the electricity industry entails. This also applies in the oil and gas industry. And I mentioned this before. You can make wrong financial projections on a field or on an oil field that does not have the requisite amount of reserves that will make it commercially viable. So if you don't validate your data independently, you run into problems of performance. You begin to fail when it's time to perform. When you get to the moment of truth and reality stares you in the face, you realize that you have overpaid for an asset. So you want to be careful around how you model the financial commitments you make. Because when you make financial commitments during your bidding process, the NUPRC will hold on to those commitments across the entire, throughout the entire process. And then you need to engage. And this, sorry to say, the financial commitments also applies to whatever arrangements you have with your financial institutions that are backing you financially, or even the investors that are putting in money. So you, as much as possible, you want everything to be feasible and balanced and realistic. Because if investors are funding you, you're pulling investors behind the scene into a vehicle to fund, and you don't manage the expectations properly, those same investors could be the ones that will scuttle everything because they can go to court, they can begin to challenge you, and you can have very bad disputes arising. They may want their money back earlier than expected. And if you don't deal with such issues carefully, everything can get messy. And then finally, you need to have good engagement with the regulator. During the pre-bid conference, attend, be present, listen to the regulators, know what they want to see, know the pain points, know the expectations, so that you can craft your bid in a way that will be accepted or will stand a very high chance of being accepted. And then you can seek written clarification, and the NUPRC typically would respond, they will clarify throughout the process until final awards are made. And then also monitor notices, guidelines that change, and so on and so forth, or even amendments to timeline. Monitor those things. Just be on top of all the issues and be able to engage properly with the regulator. So I think I believe we've come to the end of the presentation, and I would say in terms of key takeaways, just try to master the rules, familiarize yourself with the rules, ask questions, prepare rigorously. Oil business is big business. It's not an all-comers affair. It's very technical, highly rewarding, and then you have to engage transparently, both with your partners, with your bankers, and even with the regulator. Be transparent. Let nothing be hidden. If there's no capacity, find a way to bridge the gap, but don't leave any stone unturned. Thank you very much. And I think it will be a good point to take questions after 1 hour, 46 minutes.
Thank you very much, Elo. I was initially thinking that, maybe we make it a conversational one, but I realized that, the session is quite technical, but so there's need for us to have gone through the entire breadth before, people can appreciate and, have the proper questions, to be able to engage with you on the session that has been delivered. Although, we've had questions that have been sent to us via the chat box and also, privately on the chat box also too. So, but thank you so much for the engaging session so far. It's been really illuminating. For instance, I've learned that, the regulatory agency has its own dispute resolution, center. I didn't have that idea. So even though, I also did some sort of research with respect to the oil and gas industry. So I think I'll start with case question. I think before I start with case session, I just wanted to ask, is there anyone that wants to, maybe speak and ask a question? So before I uh, start with the written questions that we have, is there anyone in the chat box? If you do have, you could just raise your hand.
So I think we should give time for people to ask their questions so
Yes,
that
yes, I
there is no
agree.
interruption.
I agree because as we're going, questions were coming in privately for. So I'll start with Kay's question. So Kay has asked, how is affiliates in terms of consortium and bids defined or determined under the Act? We know that affiliate is mostly defined in terms of control, direct or indirect, and usually from percentage ownership within 5 to 10%. How is this addressed? So this is with respect, you are muted, Elo. So this is with respect to uh, the affiliates with when placing the
Yes.
bids.
So sorry,
Yes.
Hussein, go through all the questions. Go
Oh,
go
okay.
through
You
all
want
the
me to?
questions. I may be able to take two questions together.
Okay, two questions. Okay. So let me just take the two on the chat box before I go to the private one. So the second one is, as a new entrant into the oil service industry planning to bid for contract with the NUPRC or NIPX, as it were, what will make up for the bid requirements? How do we pivot to make this good? So that's two. From the public chat box. So I think what I would do next is I would give you two from the private ones that we have, and you can address two questions at the same time. Hello, are you there? No, you are muted.
Okay. Yes, I'm here. I'm looking at the second question in the chat box. So as a new entrant into the oil services industry, planning to okay. So starting with case question. Typically, the threshold for control, whether directly or indirectly, is more than 50% voting rights of the other entity. So one entity is deemed to control the other entity if it has direct or indirect ownership of more than 50% or more than 50% of the voting rights of that entity. So that's how the current guidelines, as defined control, and it is also consistent when you look at the provisions in the Local Content Act, for example. So there is that focus on more than 50% ownership. That is what the NUPRC would focus so much on. But when you are looking at control from a deeper perspective, especially from the NCDMB, which is a local content regulator, they may go into deeper considerations. For the NUPRC, they just want to pre-qualify. Okay, they say that you meet that 50% threshold, you are good, they take. But if you are dealing with more detailed local content issues with the NCDMB, but the NCDMB is not the supervisory regulatory agency for licensing rounds. But if you go to the NCDMB, they may look at how directors are appointed, for example. So even if you don't have 50% control, do you control the board? Do you have powers to nominate majority members of the board? Or do you have veto rights, even as a minority shareholder, over the operations of that company? So while you are the minority, you have veto rights that essentially makes the majority shareholder handicapped without you. So when you go to the NCDMB, you begin to deal with such nuances around control. But for the purpose of presenting bids and pre-qualifying, once you cross that 50% threshold of ownership and voting rights, typically the NUPRC will give you a pass mark for that. Then on the second question, I don't know if the participants joined a bit late, but I would say most of the things I've said answers that question. Most of the things I've said. So essentially, I mentioned some legal requirements that you must meet. You must have your certificate of incorporation showing that you're incorporated in Nigeria. Your ownership should, at the barest minimum, cross local content requirements. You must have your tax clearance certificate, your letter of good standing from the NUPRC. You should not be owing the government. You should not have issues with money laundering. You should not be linked to terrorism financing or be involved in any bribery or fraud allegations, because they will run background checks and security checks during the process. And you should have the technical capacity for the industry, and we're talking about upstream, not oil servicing now. So your oil servicing activities would qualify you for some of the technical requirements because you're already servicing companies in that sector. But you still don't have all the requisite requirements. So for example, you may be providing drilling services. That is one of the technical competencies that will be looked into. But aside from drilling services, what about environmental remediation competencies, your HSE competencies? How have you been dealing with those community issues? Do you have a plan for that, and so on and so forth? So there are other things that will be looked at. And then you must have the financial capability. If you're going to bid for a shallow water or onshore block, your turnover should have minimum of $40 million. If you convert that to Naira, that's taking you to about 60 billion Naira, or 60, around that range, between 50 to 60 billion Naira. But even if you don't have that as turnover, if you've not done turnover of that amount, or if you don't have that amount as cash in your bank balance, in your bank account, you can get a guarantee from a parent company or an affiliate to say, we have this money, we'll give it to these guys if they win a bid. Or you could also get a bank guarantee of that same amount from your banker. So essentially, these are some of the key requirements and documentation that you want to have in place if you are preparing to bid in the next round. So you look at the financial competencies and capabilities, and you also look at your technical capacity, and also ensure that your corporate documentation, your tax documents, and every other thing they're in place. You're not involved with terrorists. You don't have money laundering issues. You have a clean financial record, so that you will not be declared to be unfit and not proper. And make sure also that if you are going it alone, you are not doing anything against the national interest of Nigeria. You're working for you're not working for interest against Nigeria, or you don't have partners who are into such activity. So you scrutinize your potential partners. So as a new entrant, these are some of the issues that you need to consider.
Okay, thank you very much, Elo. So what I've done is I've taken some of the questions that we had, like two of the questions that we had on the back end that were sent to us privately on the chat box. So what I would do is because we have quite a few. So what I'll do is I'll post them in twos so that you could address two questions, as you speak. Or would you rather that I collate all the questions and then paste so that you can address them as you
Okay,
deem
let me
fit?
take the two that you've posted.
Okay.
It says, from your experience of the 2025 licensing round regulations and NUPRC 2025 guidelines, which specific regulatory red flag, e.g. fit and proper, indebtedness, FGL, and unpaid taxes, prior performance should immediately make a lawyer question whether the client should even pre-qualify? And then secondly, are there situations where even though a client can technically meet pre-qualification criteria, the PRA and NUPRC environment, e.g. local content expectations, HSE track record, those community obligations, makes it wiser to step back? Okay. So the reality is, I would say, try to be 100% during pre-qualification. And the first point I mentioned was that incomplete documentation would automatically lead to disqualification. In addition to that, all the other pitfalls I mentioned were based on direct feedback with the NUPRC. Those were some of the points made directly by the NUPRC. So these are some of the reasons why we reject some bids. So outside of the regulations, and this is where engagement is very important. So try to be 100% because if there's any deficiency, you could lose out entirely. And that is because you have several bidders who are going to meet those requirements or who are likely to meet those requirements. In some cases, the NUPRC would even decide that we didn't find any qualified bidder. So we're going to drop this particular block and put it in the next round. Because in as much as the government wants to maximize this, the government still pays particular attention to qualification criteria. They're not desperate to waive those criteria. So I would say all the red flags are red flags. All of them. No matter how minute you think that maybe in the case of indebtedness to the government, maybe you could get a waiver. And I think I mentioned it. But if you have not paid your tax, if you are owing government taxes, just forget it. In most cases, and even outside of generally public procurement, these are some of the boxes that you must tick. You can't be owing government taxes and you want government to give the national assets to you. Maybe unless there's a dispute around the tax or the amount of tax to be paid, so the matter is sub judice. And you can say, okay, but you have to disclose to say, yes, there's this issue, but the matter is still in court, or whatever the court decides, we will comply. It doesn't stop us from bidding. You understand? Those kind of statements would, make the regulator to be more comfortable. But to be owing and there's no dispute in place, nothing, you're just comfortable owing the government, you're not likely to get anything from the government. Rather, the government will start, you know, going after you. And in most cases, now digressing a bit, if you are going to the NUPRC or the minister, when you're processing ministerial consent, one of the key things that you must, one of the key hurdles that you must cross is that you must not be owing the NUPRC any fees, even if it's administrative fees. And I've dealt with instances like that, doing M&A transactions where you needed to go to the NUPRC and also the FCCPC. The NUPRC will check your record. If you are owing, they will write to you to say you are owing us 14 billion naira on so and so issue or matter. We have not seen this, we have not seen that, you have not filed this, you have not complied with this. If you don't do these things, we're not giving you consent. Your transaction, that M&A transaction, will be stalled at that point until there is compliance. So when there's compliance, you get your consent and you can move on with your transaction. So the NUPRC is very big on issues such as indebtedness, unpaid taxes, unpaid fees, and so on and so forth. But it will only be in rare cases that it would likely. I've not dealt with any case where they waived indebtedness. I've not. It's not as if it's not possible. But I would say, from a practical perspective, go with your A game, score 100% on some of those issues. Don't leave any stone unturned. And then, secondly, a situation whereby a client can technically meet pre-qualification criteria, but then it's still wiser to step back. Good. So I think I mentioned one already, but in another manner. I would say, from an economic perspective, you need to study the reserves in the reservoir. And this is where your technical people need to help. So if the reservoir is not going to be commercially viable, even if you have the technical capacity, it makes sense to just step back. So, for example, if I'm advising a client, for example, one of the pre-qualified bidders that are currently studying seismic data, maybe the financial advisors would even be in a better position on this. So they'll be working with the technical advisors to check the viability of that particular asset. How much reserves do they have? Based on the position of the reserves in the geological formation. This is subsurface work. How much stress? What would it take to be able to access the oil and gas reserves? There are some fields that it is very easy to explore. You don't need to drill so deep. And sometimes you just drill a straight well and it goes there and it hits the reservoir and you begin to pump your oil and your gas. Sometimes the reservoir does not have associated gas. So you don't have to deal with issues of gas flaring, gas gathering, and so on and so forth. But if there is associated gas, you then have to submit a plan to the NUPRC to say, this is my plan for this gas. I don't want to flare the gas, or even if I want to flare the gas, this is how long I will flare. But this is what I'm going to do to gather the gas and utilize the gas. It means that you are going to spend more money because gas is way, way, way more expensive than oil. You can just pump the oil from the ground, put it in a pipeline, send it into a vessel, and go and sell. But with gas, you may need to clean the gas, you may need to process the gas, even the plants and the equipment that you need to do this, the processing facility, huge, huge, huge financial commitment. So the moment you have associated gas in that reservoir, your financial commitment is going up. Then you need to ask yourself, do I have enough money to get into this field? Because if I start flaring the gas, any NUPRC will be imposing penalties on me. Do I have money for this penalty? Are you getting it? If I'm flaring the gas, I'm going to be degrading the environment. Do I want to start dealing with host community issues around the gas flaring? You have to start asking yourself so many questions. You are technically qualified, but what is in the ground then changes the dynamics of what your financial modeling would be. So I would say that even if you are qualified and you then discover that it's going to be really, really, really difficult from a financial perspective to operate the assets, then maybe rather than going ahead to submit a bid, it could make sense to say, look, let me step back and look elsewhere, instead of making commitments and going into a financial black hole. So that would be my response to that question. I hope I
Thank you
answered
very
it very
much.
well.
Yes, I believe so. Particularly the part of the financial commitment with respect to the gas itself. So I've dropped two more. So like I mentioned, we have quite a few. So if you could address these two, do you need me to read it, or you just read and then
Okay, so
respond?
you note that VDR and PDR data may contain discrepancies and that independent validation is essential. What minimum level of independent technical and legal due diligence should a lawyer insist on before endorsing a bid? And secondly, can you give examples where poor data interpretation or failure to stress test NUPRC data led to uneconomic work programs or signature bonuses that later hurt or doomed projects? Okay, on the first question, I would say, as a lawyer, you don't necessarily, the final decision on the bid rests with the businessman. Your own duty is to point out the legal risk and to advise on mitigation strategies from a legal perspective. You shouldn't even delve so much. Yes, it's multidisciplinary, and in providing your legal advice, you also have to look at technical and financial details. Because if they make financial commitment and they cannot meet up, you can end up in court over those commitments. So those financial commitments become legal issues. You get it? So you would want to typically get enough comfort or uh, representations or guarantees from the technical experts in written form, in written statements, to make representations that the reservoir, the economic viability of the reservoir is sufficient for the commitments that are being made or that will be made. So maybe not from a due diligence perspective, because the lawyer will not do the due diligence on the technical side of things. It will be the technical experts that will do the due diligence and assess the seismic data. They are the ones that will interpret the seismic data. So what you need as a lawyer is a written statement or report, a technical report from the technical experts that the field is viable. In that report, they should be able to state the risks and challenges that they would likely encounter in operating that field. And that will then go into the financial modeling. And as when you are drafting the technical sections of whatever agreements you're preparing, you will then know the kind of warranties to include, indemnities and warranties to include in whatever arrangement you want to have or put in place. You want to advise your client to insist upon, so that if things go wrong, you can have some form of remedy against the technical experts for any misrepresentations they might have made. I think that's the angle from which you can look at it from a legal perspective. But in terms of doing the actual due diligence, there's not much a lawyer needs to do about interpreting seismic data. He didn't study physics, he studied law. He studied law. So if the data is wrong, as a lawyer, you have no way of knowing. It is the technical expert that will say the data is wrong. And so you should be able to ask the technical experts to make a statement that the data is correct, so that you can hold on to that statement if it turns out to be wrong. I say this is a professional misstatement. So issues of professional liability of the technical experts will then come up when you encounter such matters. So that's the approach to dealing with that as a lawyer. And then, yes, talking about level of independence, technical due diligence. So you can have a bidding entity may have its own technical staff that should interpret the data. That is not independent. That is you as the bidder interpreting that data. When you then subcontract that role, you engage a professional technical advisor to do the work for you. You would have to pay fees for that professional service. So in the technical service agreements you're going to sign with that technical advisor, you will put some of these things that I've mentioned, these protective measures, ability to rely on the accuracy of the report, and if the report is false, the remedies and all of that. So between your client and the technical advisor, you would have to negotiate that in the technical service agreement. So that is how you deal with independent technical due diligence on the data. Then on the second question, I think I have not worked on any particular matter, but if we started having bid rounds since over 20 years ago, when the Obasanjo administration first came up with the marginal field rounds and so on. If you go and check the records from the 2005 rounds, virtually most of the people that were given licenses couldn't do much. They couldn't do much. And based on industry research, one of the reasons for the failure to, work those assets is because of, yes, on economic work programs is one of them. Some of them could not pay signature bonuses. NUPRC took action. There's a case that comes to, I can't remember the case. There's a case about signature bonus, delay in signature bonus that led NUPRC to then revoke the award. And then I think one of the issues that came up was whether there was issue of past performance and all those other legal principles, because they were asking for specific performance. Please, if anyone can drop the case in the chat box, I would really appreciate it. I know there's a case like that. I came across, I think I can't remember the exact case now. Can't remember the exact case, but there is a case like that. They had to start asking for specific performance to compare the DPR as it then was, to issue the license, saying that, look, we didn't have money before. We've already paid part of the money. Now we now have the full money. You understand? But at that point, the government are taking steps to revoke. So you don't want to get into such. So you have issues of delayed signature bonuses. And once a matter gets to court, the parties will start securing injunctive orders. So when an injunctive order is secured over an asset, if there's a new bidder that's been given that asset, it can affect that new bidder. So even the new bidder will be prevented from going into the asset to maximize to produce anything or to explore. So on the one hand, the previous bidder that couldn't meet up with his obligation, that then lost out, has gotten injunctive relief, is not doing anything on the asset. On the other hand, the new person or the new entity that has been awarded that asset is faced with an injunctive order. If he wants to go in there, you will find security operatives stopping you based on the court order. And court orders must be obeyed. And then you have the government that is now hamstrung. They can't move forward, they can't move backward until the matter is resolved in court. And most times, because the stakes are high, the matters usually get to the Supreme Court. Except for any reason, the parties just decide that, okay, let's settle out of court, or let's just let go. But it's very difficult in oil and gas disputes. They usually go all the way because the stakes are high. And also the benefit of success in litigation is also very huge. You will see claim damages or remedies running into billions across the energy. The energy industry is capital intensive. Claims are expensive. Remedies are expensive. They are huge. You understand? So it can be a payday for one of the parties or any party that wins. So the parties usually fight, to the very end. And while they're on that journey, there's so much delay. The country is losing out. Everybody is losing out. Even the investors are losing out. Even the banks. And this is where you have a lot of non-performing loans. Some banks during that period, I think there was a time that banks were so wary of giving loans to oil and gas companies after that very bad experience. Because some of them funded these companies during that period and they couldn't make progress. And the loans turned bad. And some of those loans, I think, that's why sometimes even the CBN, because the banking industry is so exposed to the oil and gas industry. And that's why most times the CBN would ask them for recapitalization. I'll give you an example. Last year, the CBN came up with forbearance instruction saying that certain banks that have not exited forbearance cannot pay dividends and so on. And when some analysts then came up with the nature of the forbearance loan, there was a particular bank, I'll not mention the name, almost, I think the loans from those two entities, there were two oil and gas entities, and the loan exposure is in excess of 500 billion naira, at least based on the disclosure that was made by the bank itself. Just two entities, oil and gas related loans, because of the capital intensive nature. So you see that even the banks suffer, a lot of parties suffer when matters go to court and things go bad. So based on research, based on industry information, all these items that you mentioned on economic work programs, delay in paying signature bonuses, which then leads to revocation. And most times when government revokes a license, they don't want to come back because it now becomes a question of, questioning the discretion of government. And governments would always try to prove that it was right. So most times, these are the things that will doom some of those bids that you mentioned. So your examples are correct. I have not handled one directly, but based on industry research and based on matters that are in court and based on disclosures that have been made in the public space, those are some of the examples. Those examples are real. So
Okay,
there's
thank
another
you.
question.
Yes.
Says
So,
looking
so
at
before I
the
go to,
key. Yes, go
sorry,
ahead.
Elo, before I go to the question, so have you dropped in a case? Is asking whether that might that be the case you were trying to remember? FGM versus Zebra Energy.
Yes, that's one of them.
That's one of
But there's
them.
another case like that. But that's
Okay.
one, yeah, Zebra Energy. I remember the Zebra Energy case. But those cases are bound. And
Okay.
then
Thank you.
looking at, I think the Monipulo case also has to do with signature bonuses. And then you have another question. It says looking at the key parameters for winning signature, no, not winning signature bonus, or for winning bids. That's the signature bonus, work program commitments, performance security, and weighted scores. How should a lawyer help the client decide how high is too high on bonus and commitment? I think I discussed this. I'll come back to it. And then how have you seen cases where bidders won with aggressive offers that became unfinanceable within 90-day compliance window? Absolutely. I've handled one. uh, bonus guarantees, and what early warnings should a lawyer look for? So let me start with the second one. Most times, most times, the bidders rely on promises or commitments, financial commitments made by investors and financial institutions. What we see going on in the industry these days, you would not easily find a bank advancing loans for this process. They will typically wait for you to get the license and the award because then if there's a dispute, they can attach the asset itself. It's easy for the bank to go after the asset. So any loan that they're going to give to the entity will be secured by the asset itself. You see things like reserve-based lending, and so on, like the one that Arade recently concluded that was announced. It was based on reserve-based lending. So if Arade fails to pay on that loan, the financial institutions that granted that facility, they will just take over the production that is coming from all the assets. So they will help Arade to sell the oil. The money will go into their bank account. When they finish recovering, Arade can continue. I'm using that example because it was published. I didn't work on it. So I'm just giving that as an example that is publicly available, just to clarify. You would typically have investors, HNIs, family offices, institutional investors, financial, people that manage capital, private equity investors, provide some of this financial backing. Now, the investors, they are not individuals, they are corporate entities. Sometimes they pull back. So one that I handled, as at the time they were submitting bid, they had assurances from this particular private equity investor and a foreign investor, to bring in money. And when it was time to pay the signature bonus, this particular investor was nowhere to be found. So the bidder started, running from pillar to post, looking for wood, and there was a deadline for payment. If you don't meet the deadline for paying that signature bonus, the asset goes to the reserve bidder. Don't forget. So they needed to meet up with that deadline. And at the end of the day, the commitment they now made with whoever provided or agreed to provide the financing, the negotiation dynamics changed. You get it? So because there was desperation and even though from a legal perspective, there are certain things that you would advise your client not to accept and all of that. But sometimes the businessmen, because they are looking at the ultimate goal, they are looking at the business prospect, they can waive some of the professional advice that they receive and say, look, it's better for us to sign this agreement than for us to lose out completely because we could not meet up with payment. So you typically find instances like that where for business exigencies, they decide not to go with professional advice. They sign something that is onerous, but then they meet up and then hope to then manage the relationship with the new financial partner. So you find this typically in the industry sometimes. Sometimes they don't even find somebody that would assist financially. Because like I mentioned at the beginning, it's usually very difficult to find one single entity that meets all the requirements. That entity must have been in the industry and making serious money. We're talking about turnover of 40 or 60 billion. That is even for shallow and onshore assets. For deep water, it's $100 million. So you are looking at a balance sheet of close to 140 billion naira. Are you getting it? So have you done business that generated that kind of turnover? How many companies generate business in Nigeria with that kind of turnover? How many companies have that kind of amount of money in their bank accounts? If you go to the NGX disclosure portal and you begin to read financial statements, you'll be shocked because everything is there. The very big companies, if you check their account balance, some of them have 11 billion naira, some 100 billion, some 80 billion. There are very few that have so much money in their bank balances. So automatically, it means that the players are few. The players with financial capacity, in reality, they are few. So you need a lot of financial backing from financial institutions. Sometimes these institutions and private equity investors, they come together to pool the funds to be able to back a bid. So you would have a problem typically if someone pulls out, someone that says they will bring money, when they pull out, the entire consortium can become naked financially and it can lead to serious problems. So I've seen instances where a consortium has won a bid. When it's time for signature bonus, 90-day period, they are running from pillar to post because the commitment has not been fully met. But for entities that already have the money, they don't even need to wait for 90 days. They can pay the next day. So even that 90-day rule is because the NUPRC itself knows and realizes that money is needed in the industry. They know that these guys have to go and look for, even government itself goes to look for financial support for oil business, not to talk of the private guys. So it's important to, because if money was not an issue, there won't be any need for 90 days. 90 days is 3 months. So the government gives you 3 months to run around for the money after you have won the bid, because they know the challenges that comes with financing oil and gas business. So everybody has to be realistic. And in some cases, I've seen instances where you can also approach the government, the NUPRC, for extension and appeal for discretionary. You can have such instances, and especially if you then have provisions like that in the guidelines, because everybody just has to be realistic at the end of the day. And then the next question. So early warning signs a lawyer should look out for. Typically, your due diligence would show you the warning sign. If your client is relying 100% on external parties for funding, that's a warning sign. Because it means that you are relying on the promise of another party that can fail you. But if your client has part of the money, say 10%, 20%, 30% of the funding that is required, it makes things easier. So if another party that has promised to bring in the balance pulls out, you are not back to ground zero. It gives you leverage to negotiate both ways, both with the regulator to say, look, I now have 90 days. This is 30% of the money, or I have 30% of the money in my bank account. These are the plans I have in place to, meet up with the shortfall. There's disappointment along the way with the partner, but this is what we are doing to replace the partner. But even the regulator has some level of comfort that you have some of the money. And that's why even when you go to a bank will ask you to make contribution to the loan amount. So if you're asking for 100 billion, you're able to show that you have 10 or 20 or 5 billion or 50, as the case may be, depending on the requirements of the bank. You cannot go empty. You cannot go with zero looking for the entire money. But there are some ambitious bidders like that also win big, and they fall into that scenario. So it's a big red flag. And so what you should typically advise such a client to do, maybe probably pay attention to exclusivity arrangements with potential financial institutions that want to support. Because if you give a financial institution exclusive right, it means that you can't discuss with another potential funder. And if the financial institution that you've made arrangements with, for any reason, even though you may have remedies, for any reason pulls out at the late hour and you cannot get a replacement, even though you can go to court later to say, I gave you exclusive rights, you did not fulfill your part of the bargain, I lost out, these are my remedies. Even though you can pursue that remedy in court later, but you are losing out on something bigger. So maybe you want to moderate that kind of exclusivity provision in whatever arrangement you are negotiating or your client is negotiating, so that you can discuss with as many potential financial supporters. And you can structure it in such a way that maybe you don't have to rely on a sole funder, or maybe you can give each party different levels of priority. And also, you can also decide to, if your client can get investors that want to put in patient capital, take up equity, for example, it makes it much easier. So you have very little pressure to pay back, but before you find people that want to just put in equity solely, then whatever is in the reservoir has to be convincing as well, So those are some of the considerations that a lawyer should look out for when advising his or her clients, and businessmen as well should pay attention to those matters.
So the question on how to determine how high is too high on bonus and
Okay,
commitments.
I missed that, right?
Yes, you said you were going to come back to it.
Yes. So for work program commitments, okay, for signature bonus, you have a band between $3 million to $7 million. The NUPRC does not expect you to go beyond $7 million. For example. So you shouldn't go beyond $7 million, which is the highest threshold that the NUPRC has set for the current process. Now, for the program commitment, the financial commitment for the work program has to be tied to the technical reports that has been provided. The technical data, what is in the reservoir. So in a particular, there are some oil fields in Nigeria today that are no longer producing. There are some. So sometimes if an oil well can dry up. So any projection you are making, your financial commitment for a work program should be based on what your technical advisors have seen from the seismic data and the estimated capacity in that reservoir. So if the commitment is higher, and then you have to benchmark it with other financial risk, FX issues, and so on and so forth. So for example, there is an ongoing war in the Middle East that has taken the price of crude oil above $100 per barrel, depending on the grade of crude oil. In some instances, the Oman crude, the Oman blend of crude, which is a very sweet crude, was selling at some point in the last couple of days for as much as $170 per barrel. Because it's very sweet, it's very easy to refine, it's hot cake. Brent crude, which we use to benchmark our own Bonny Light and Kwaibo crude, is also hot cake because it is easy to process. So Brent crude, you see that Brent crude is always higher than West Texas crude, WTI, because the crude in Texas is not as clean and sweet as Brent crude or Bonny Light crude in Nigeria or the crude in Oman. The crude in Venezuela is very difficult to, as well as Russian crude. So you have different grades of crude, but the prices generally are either hovering around 90, 100, 110, $120 per barrel. So if you are making projections, financial commitment projections on your work program, it is safer to discount this premium that is based on the war that is going on when making that projection. If you make projections thinking that crude oil price would continue to be above $100 per barrel, when it drops to below $50 per barrel, like it did during Buhari's time, you would face the music. Let me put it that way. You will run at a loss. You will run at a loss. So, for example, if you look at the financial records and the financial projection by companies such as Aradel, Seplat, Wando, and so on for this year, and even government, they've made their projections and their financial commitment, benchmarking it on a price of $55 per barrel. So, and they did all of that when oil was selling at around $70 per barrel. So they gave room to say, look, anything can happen in the world. We don't know what somebody can do in the US or in Russia or in Ukraine or in the UK or in the Middle East. We don't know what will happen. But in case anything happens, let's give ourselves a margin of, safety. Let's not make projections based on $70 per barrel. Let's make projections based on $55 per barrel. So that if things go south, we still have enough margin to stay afloat. So that is the approach that I know we are lawyers, but when you're dealing with oil and gas matters and highly technical business sectors like this, even though you are not going to provide legal advice on financial matters or technical matters, you should know. You should know the basis on which some of these things are provided, because then the commercial issues ultimately become legal. So as a lawyer in this sector, you should be vast and understand how financial advisors and technical guys in the sector think. So when making projections based on the work program commitment, as a lawyer, you can flag to your clients on what benchmark have your commercial guys made this projection. You don't have to question whatever the other financial or the other professionals have done or said, but you can just flag to your clients to say, look, this is a risk that you should pay attention to in case geopolitical risk or other economic risk makes this benchmark less feasible. You run the risk of defaulting on your financial obligations. And when you default on your financial obligations, these are the consequences for you from a legal perspective. So you can come from that angle. You have not provided financial advice, but you've drawn your clients to financial risk that could dovetail into legal liability. So that is, but if as a lawyer, you don't even know these things, how do you advise your client? And if your client realizes that some of all these other technical details, you cannot identify or even relate, they'll change you as a lawyer. They're likely to change you. So it's a technical area, and you have to be ready to read those other non-legal stuff. You have to understand the business. You have to understand the business. So from that perspective, so that's how to handle the issue of how high you should go. You understand, essentially, but it is not your place as a lawyer to provide that advice. You can only flag to your clients to pay attention to the benchmark that they are using and the modeling, and leave your clients to make his own financial and business decision. But just let your client know that any benchmark they use, any modeling they use that results in default or other financial legal commitment, you're going to get into trouble. You may have claims and disputes to deal with along the way. And the same thing applies to performance security. So, like I mentioned, if you know that 1% is what you can do, then stick to it, because that's the barest minimum as advised by the NUPRC for the current round. But if you have so much money, your money is too much, you get it, then you can do more, because it then gives you can even decide, you can even tell the enterprise that, look, I have too much money, I will give you 100%. See the money is on ground. Give me this asset. Look at the money. I'm giving you security. You understand? You can depend. So it all depends on your financial capacity. So if you can do more than 1% without going to the bank to take a loan, or without affecting your financial health as a company, then it makes sense. If I'm a businessman and I'm in a position to outbid my competitors without feeling it, then why not? It's competition. That's what it's all about. But the only problem is when you make promises, you give security, and then you cannot meet up. You would face legal consequences. Absolutely. And then I think there's another question.
Yes.
It says, is it one or two?
So there are two. So there
Okay.
were other questions also
Yeah,
too, but I think from the answers you've given so far, you've addressed them. So
I've addressed
this will
them.
be the
Okay.
last two questions.
Okay. Because we've almost done 3 hours. I'm just mindful of the time
Yes.
for everyone.
Yes.
It says, if you were designing a pre-submission checklist for a law firm supporting bids in this round, what items would absolutely have to be on it? I think everything I've said, if this presentation is recorded, I think everything I've said answers this. I think everything I've said answers this.
I think particularly the pitfalls are identified also too.
And then the requirements and the
Mhm.
criteria as well. I think when you put everything together, it answers this. Because if I start generating a checklist for you now, it's going to be long. If I want to follow it, I would almost likely be discussing almost every issue I've identified in the 1 hour, 45 minutes of my presentation. And we can't go through all of that again. So I think the presentation is, I think I answered all of this in the presentation, the legal requirements, the criteria. So as much as possible, your checklist, just to answer this question, your checklist should be based on the pre-qualification criteria. It's like you are working from the answer to the question. So the regulation and the guidelines gives you the marking scheme. So you already have a marking scheme. So you know that if you have A, you have scored points. If you have B, you have scored points. So just make sure that everything in the marking scheme, you provide them to the regulator, you will pre-qualify. So that should form the basis of your checklist. So if your checklist overlooks any regulatory requirement, then I think from that point, that bid has started failing. And are there practices in documenting compliance and communications with NUPRC that you recommend so a client is litigation ready if evaluation is questioned? What is written is written. I think Christians would understand that particular phrase is called from the Bible. You know, what is written is written. So put everything in black and white as much as possible. Send via email. Get written feedback as much as possible. In some cases, feedback could be oral. Maybe the NUPRC or the relevant staff in the NUPRC does not want to be put on record. You could have, especially when the matter is very sensitive. But the rule of the thumb is to get on your email and send an email in writing, or you write formally and submit a hard copy letter that the NUPRC can respond to, also in writing. And more often than not, the NUPRC actually also likes to communicate in writing. Because just the same way that you want to protect yourself or you want to be litigation ready, after the historical, experiences of that the NUPRC has had with litigation, they also know that, okay, we also have to, be ready. So they also put things in record so that they will tell you that this is what we told you. This was our advice, this was our response, and you went against it. So everything is clear. So they can use that as a basis to take both administrative or regulatory action against you. Or if they get to court, they can use it as a defense. Say, this was what we told you when you brought the issue up. So it works both ways, but it just helps everybody to put things in writing. Don't let it be in your chest or in your heart, because at that point, it will not become your word against the word of someone else. So just put everything in writing. And when you are dealing with business opportunities that are this massive, I think it just makes sense to be willing to always write, even as a way of protecting yourself from a professional liability perspective. It's good to always put things in writing so that, because some clients, they may feel so sore about their loss, they may go after their lawyer. And not just clients, even we've had an issue where the federal government of Nigeria, they've had to go after a former attorney general that served the country well and took him through very rigorous, painful litigation process within and outside the country. It's public information. As of today, it turned out that he has been absolved both within and outside the country of any wrongdoing. And I hope I'm correct on that. And I think one of the last issues around that matter was that he was asking for an apology from the government for all the embarrassment and the stress and all of that. So oil and gas business and opportunities, but even from a government perspective, can be a very sore point to the extent that they can go after anybody. So if governments can go after a former attorney general, or even its own officers. A client can also proceed against its own professional advisors, maybe even if not the lawyer. It could be the financial advisor, it could be the technical advisor, for advising them wrongly in a very glaring manner. So it's something that one needs to be careful about and be very measured, very conservative, put things in writing if you need clarification. And when advising the client as well, don't advise clients by word of mouth. This is oil is different from doing without. I'm not trying to denigrate any practice, but you can have discussions around selling a property, and then you close the deal easily. There will be no problem. But this is very different from that. You want to also, as a practitioner, keep your own records to show that you, as a practitioner, you advise the client properly. And in cases where the client has obviously gone out of the way, out of the way of the legal advice that you provided, to take steps that then cause injury, they can't come after you to say you didn't advise us well. Because a lot is at stake. So they'll say, when things go wrong, they say, did our lawyers tell us this thing? You understand? They'll start asking, did our lawyers even tell us that this thing was going to happen and so on and so forth? So they start looking for, because the loss is so huge. And because you are dealing with humans as well, even though they are legal entities, they are corporate entities, but it's still humans that set up those entities. It's humans that provided the money in those entities. So you don't know how they would react. So a client may feel so sore about a loss, and they will be looking for scapegoats. So if they cannot find the scapegoats amongst their partners, they may start looking at their professional advisors. Is there something they could have told us that would have prevented this damage or this loss? And if you have found one thing, they could go after you. So put things in writing, not just when engaging with the regulator, when engaging with your client. Send that email. Sometimes a client may prefer to communicate by WhatsApp and all, but there's a way you can still take it to email to say, based on our previous discussion, this was where we discussed blah 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 and so on and so forth. You've created an email record in case you lose your WhatsApp record or something happens to your phone or you didn't back it up. Your email record would always be there. So as a practitioner, that is the rule of the thumb.
I agree. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elo. So, and thank you so much for everyone that has patiently waited to the end of this session. I know there's a rule of the thumb saying the more boring a thing is, the more rewarding it is, because you don't get the high rewarding areas without having to go through the entire gamut of things to ensure that the proper things are put in check. So, Ella, thank you so much. And I would like to call on one of our admin reps, AGK Glory, Doctor in Waiting, AGK Glory, for the young legal professionals to please give us our vote of thanks. So I would be inviting her to unmute. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you very much for those who stayed from the beginning, those who joined, and those who are still here till now. I would like to say a big thank you to Elo for facilitating this very insightful session today. It's been very interesting. I've learned a lot myself, and I believe that is same for everyone else. Hello, thank you for your time today. I know how weekends usually is for everyone, so thank you for taking out time to break these things down for us, particularly those of us who are not in this field. Even those who are in the field as well. It's been very wonderful listening to you. This is a very technical area of practice, and you have been able to deliver such an engaging and such an insightful session. Indeed, it is truly, truly a knowledge sharing session. Thank you very much for your time. On behalf of the young legal professionals, I say thank you, and hopefully one or two persons from here will work with you on some big briefs very soon. And to everyone who joined and everyone who's still here, everyone who asked questions, who engaged with the session. I also say thank you very much. And to our wonderful KSC, our knowledge sharing committee of the young legal professionals, thank you for putting together such a very good and key session considering where we are today in the world. So thank you very much for putting this together, and we hope to see more of this. Thank you and well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
very
much,
much.
everyone.
And I would like to say that no matter how onerous the financial requirements are, there's no harm in dreaming. So if you have the leverage, if you can put something together and get the right people in the room, anyone here can also become the owner of an oil block. You don't own an oil block 100% typically.
Is it?
You understand? So there's enough to go around if things go well. So if you are ready to, for those that are willing to always, collaborate and partner, there's nothing that stops people from coming together and then looking for, if the proposal is good enough, you can always get financial backing, and then you can never tell what happened. I know some persons that never believed they could win, get oil blocks. I think the first uh, uh, issuance that was done by this present administration, some of them got, at least I know two. I was not part of them. I was not part of it. I know there are some persons that it's not as if they've really been in the industry, but they just took that step of faith. And they got their award because probably they were able to assemble the right team together. So I think aside from learning uh, together, you can also put some of these things into play if you have the heart and if you can face the challenges and rigors. That's how Dangote started. And I think as young people, we should encourage ourselves to look at opportunities not from the perspective of something that is unreachable. You can start from somewhere and tomorrow you can make it big. I think I always look back at Tony Lumelu's story. He didn't start big, but somehow he had that big dream of owning a bank, and today is where he is. Thank you very
Thank you very
much.
much. Even Wale Tinubu of Orlando also had a session. I think he posted on his Instagram where a snapshot of a session he attended, and he spoke about how they got their own licensing, their licensing awarded. And one of the key things he made mention of was clear regulation, and they were able to put things into circumspect and apply and get it based on a fair and transparent process, which were the key things he made mention of when he was giving his speech. So I think I concur with you. It's a matter of time. They didn't start, the leaders of today didn't fall off from the sky. They also started from somewhere. So in due time, I'm optimistic that we too will be up there. So thank you very much, everyone. And with that, we've come to the end of the session. Thank you. Bye, guys.